Welcome back, sweet dreamer. Tonight on Sleepy Crown, we continue our tranquil journey through the Roman Empire in Part 3, beginning with the remarkable rise of Vespasian, the general who claimed the imperial throne, and gently moving through the beloved reign of Titus before arriving at the complex and tragic rule of Domitian, Rome's final Flavian emperor. Before you let sleep take you away, please like this peaceful tale, share a comment about which Roman emperor's story resonated most with you, and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Get comfy under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft echo of ancient Roman grandeur to carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, we're always happy to have you here in our cozy circle of history lovers. Vespasian, the general who became Emperor Vespasian, later known as Emperor Titus Flavius Vespasianus, entered this world on November 17th in the year 9th AD. Born in the modest village of Phalacrine, nestled in the rolling hills northeast of Rome's eternal city, his humble beginnings in central Italy would seem an unlikely start for one destined to wear the imperial purple and establish a dynasty that would rule the greatest empire of the ancient world. His father, Titus Flavius Sabinus, belonged to the gens Flavia, an equestrian family that had experienced both fortune and misfortune throughout the centuries of Roman history. Though the Flavians had once achieved prominence, with a family member claiming the consulship in 104 BC during the late Republic, their status had declined significantly by Vespasian's time. This downfall stemmed largely from his grandfather's unfortunate choice to support Pompeius Magnus against Julius Caesar during the devastating civil wars between 49 and 46 BC. Like many Pompeians who found themselves on the losing side, the family faced sanctions and diminished standing in the new order that emerged from Caesar's victory. Consequently, Vespasian's father found himself relegated to the unglamorous work of a tax collector in the province of Asia, in what we now know as Western Turkey. Later, he would ply his trade as a moneylender among the Helvetii tribes north of Italy, in the region that would become Switzerland. These were hardly distinguished occupations for someone whose descendant would one day command legions and rule an empire stretching from Britain to the Euphrates. Vespasian's mother, Vespasia Polla, brought somewhat better connections to the family union. Her lineage traced back to a more prominent equestrian family, one that had maintained its standing through the tumultuous transition from republic to empire. Her father had achieved the respectable rank of camp prefect, the third highest position within a Roman legion's command structure. More significantly, her brother had managed to secure entry into the Roman Senate, that exclusive body of Rome's wealthiest and most influential citizens. While both families belonged to the equestrian class, the second tier of Roman society, equivalent to a knightly class beneath the patrician aristocracy, Vespasia's connections provided the family with important social capital that would prove valuable in Vespasian's later ascent. The young Vespasian received his education in the coastal town of Cosa, a picturesque settlement in southwestern Tuscany that overlooked the azure waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea. His formative years unfolded under the watchful care of his paternal grandmother, Tertulla, whose estate sprawled across the Tuscan countryside. The education she arranged for him followed the traditional Roman curriculum, emphasizing the core subjects deemed essential for any young Roman of good family: rhetoric to master the art of persuasion, grammar to achieve eloquence in speech and writing, philosophy to develop wisdom and character, and immersion in the great works of Roman literature. Among these classics, none held more importance than Virgil's Aeneid, completed just years before Vespasian's birth. This epic masterpiece wove together Rome's foundation mythology, tracing the city's noble lineage back to Prince Aeneas of Troy, who had fled his burning city to establish a new homeland in Italy. For young Romans like Vespasian, the Aeneid provided not just literary education, but also a sense of destiny and connection to Rome's glorious past. The fondness Vespasian developed for his grandmother and her Tuscan estate would endure throughout his life. Even decades later, when the weight of empire rested upon his shoulders, he would return to Cosa regularly, finding solace in the familiar landscapes of his youth. These visits offered respite from the burdens of rule and reconnected him with his humble origins, a grounding that would characterize his approach to imperial power. Beyond these glimpses of his education and early influences, the details of Vespasian's childhood remained frustratingly sparse. Roman record-keeping, while extensive, often overlooked the early years of even prominent figures unless their childhoods contained obvious portents of future greatness. What we can deduce is that his education would have concluded around the early 20s AD, as Roman society considered children to reach adulthood around age 14, a concept of adolescence being largely unknown in ancient times. Coming from his middling equestrian background, Vespasian naturally gravitated toward military service as his pathway to advancement. The Roman army offered one of the few reliable routes for ambitious young men to distinguish themselves and launch political careers. Military competence could open doors to the magistracies, governorships, and ultimately senatorial rank that represented the pinnacle of Roman achievement. Vespasian's formative years unfolded during a period of remarkable transformation in Roman civilization. The city had emerged as a Mediterranean power during the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, gradually expanding its influence until it dominated both the Western and Eastern Mediterranean by the 1st century BC. Yet despite controlling vast territories, Rome remained constitutionally a republic throughout these centuries of expansion, governed by the Senate and various elected magistrates including consuls, aediles, praetors, and quaestors, who served limited terms. However, the republic's extraordinary growth created the very conditions for its eventual demise. The constant expansion brought immense wealth, glory, and prestige to individual commanders, making Rome's generals increasingly powerful and difficult for traditional institutions to control. By the 1st century BC, a series of devastating civil wars had erupted as figures like Cornelius Sulla, Gaius Marius, Julius Caesar, and Pompeius Magnus sought to dominate the Roman state through military force rather than constitutional means. The ultimate victor in this struggle was Octavian, Julius Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir. In 27 BC, after eliminating all rivals, he established a new constitutional arrangement for himself. Taking the name Caesar Augustus, he adopted the title Princeps, or First Citizen of Rome, though history remembers him primarily by another of his titles, Imperator, meaning commander, from which our modern word emperor derives. While these momentous events had occurred decades before Vespasian's birth, they remained crucial to understanding his later rise to power. The precedent Augustus established that a Roman general with sufficient military support could claim supreme authority within the Roman state never truly disappeared. This possibility would prove particularly relevant given the apparent problems with Augustus's successors from the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Augustus died on August 14th AD, when Vespasian was merely 4 years old. His immediate successor, Tiberius, earned a reputation as a poor ruler who absented himself from Rome for extended periods, delegating excessive authority to Sejanus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the only military force permitted within the Italian peninsula. Tiberius's reign concluded on a note of apparent tyranny in the 30s AD, a troubling development that was compounded by his successor, Caligula's ascension in 37 AD. Caligula became notorious for his sadism, sexual deviance, and bizarre behavior, including his alleged plan to make his horse Incitatus a consul. While modern historians question the accuracy of these characterizations by later Roman writers, the general perception remained that Augustus's heirs had failed to maintain the standard of leadership he had established. This perceived weakness in the Julio-Claudian dynasty would eventually open opportunities for new claimants to power, opportunities that Vespasian would ultimately seize. Vespasian's early military career demonstrated the gradual promotion through ranks that characterized the Roman war machine. He began his service in Thrace, encompassing what is now European Turkey and Bulgaria, holding the position of military tribune. This middle-ranking officer position placed him in command of several hundred men within a legion, each legion consisting of between 5,000 and 6,000 soldiers when including auxiliary personnel. From this foundation, he advanced to the rank of quaestor in the province of Crete and Cyrenaica, the Roman designation for Libya. As quaestor, he assumed responsibility for the province's military garrisons, though Crete and Cyrenaica ranked among the empire's poorer provinces with relatively small forces. Most of these troops were stationed in desert outposts throughout Cyrenaica, tasked with preventing Berber raiders from attacking Roman settlements along the Mediterranean coastline. Though this assignment might have seemed inauspicious, it qualified him to seek election as aedile. After several unsuccessful attempts, he finally obtained this office in 38 AD. The aedileship placed him in charge of managing public buildings and events in Rome, providing valuable opportunities to cultivate relationships among the Roman patrician class and within the central government during the late 30s AD. These connections enabled him to win election as praetor in either 39 or 40 AD, achieving the second highest magistracy in the Roman political hierarchy, surpassed only by the consulship and, of course, the emperor himself. Vespasian was likely serving in this capacity when, in January 41st AD, the Praetorian Guard, with the cooperation of numerous senators and court officials, assassinated Caligula and elevated his uncle Claudius to the throne. During these years of political advancement, Vespasian also established his family life. Sometime between 37 and 38 AD, approaching his 30th year, he married Flavia Domitilla, daughter of Flavius Liberalis, a quaestor's clerk from Ferentinum in Italy. Her extremely humble background, the family may have descended from freed slaves, indicated that this was not a political marriage designed to advance Vespasian's social standing. Instead, it appears to have been a genuine personal attachment. Their union eventually produced 3 children. A son named Titus arrived in the final days of 39 AD. A daughter, also named Domitilla after her mother, was born several years later, possibly around 45 AD, though the exact date remains unclear. A second son followed after a considerable interval. Arriving in October 51st AD, Vespasian also maintained during these years a contubernium relationship with Antonia Canis, a recently freed slave woman. Such arrangements in Roman society typically involved either 2 slaves or a free citizen and a slave, in this case, a rising Roman magistrate and a former slave. Crucially, Antonia Canis served as secretary and aide to Antonia Minor, mother of the new emperor Claudius. This connection would facilitate Vespasian's continued advancement under the new regime. Vespasian's involvement in one of the most significant military enterprises of the early empire began in the 40s AD. Augustus had advised Tiberius that future emperors should focus on consolidating the vast Roman Empire rather than pursuing further conquests after 2 centuries of relentless expansion. Tiberius had largely heeded this counsel, but Caligula had been preparing an invasion of Britain when assassinated, and Claudius determined to proceed with the plan. Perhaps because he was disabled, walking with a limp, and suffering from partial deafness, Claudius felt compelled to prove his martial capabilities despite his physical limitations. He decided to complete his nephew's proposed campaign and ordered the invasion of Britain in the early 40s AD. Julius Caesar had visited Britain twice in the mid-50s BC, but had not undertaken major military campaigns there, while Augustus had planned several invasions that never materialized, leaving Britain outside imperial control. Yet extensive trade connections existed with the island's inhabitants, and Romans were well aware of valuable tin deposits in the West Country that could prove lucrative if southern England fell under Roman control. After a century of considering such an enterprise, Claudius finally launched his invasion of Britain in 43 AD. While the exact scale of the Roman force remains unknown, it most likely numbered between 35,000 and 40,000 legionaries, comprising 4 Roman legions, augmented by another 15,000 to 20,000 auxiliary troops. Vespasian played a central role in this historic campaign. While Aulus Plautius commanded the overall invasion, with Claudius positioned in northern Gaul awaiting the appropriate moment to cross the English Channel, Vespasian, having recently served as praetor, received appointment as a legate commanding one of the participating legions, the Legio II Augusta. The armies crossed to southern England aboard hundreds of transport vessels, though historians continue to debate the exact landing location. From there, they advanced northward to secure the Thames riverside site where central London stands today, where the Celtic Britons had established a settlement. At this location, Vespasian participated in a major engagement against regional Celtic tribes, including the Atrebates, Trinovantes, and Catuvalauni. Following the establishment of Roman control in this crucial area, Plautius continued northeast to secure Colchester, the foremost Celtic oppidum or hill fort town in southern England. Meanwhile, Vespasian received orders to advance southwest, targeting the tin and silver mines in Cornwall and Somerset. During this campaign, he conquered over a dozen Celtic oppida and occupied the Isle of Wight before establishing his headquarters in what would become Exeter. The initial conquest proceeded with such remarkable speed that Claudius was able to cross the Channel later in 43 AD to receive the submission of 11 British kings in southern Britain. The emperor then returned to Rome to celebrate his military triumph, while Vespasian and other generals remained in England through the second half of the 40s AD, gradually consolidating their conquest and extending Roman borders into the English, Midlands, and southern Wales. Vespasian finally achieved Rome's highest political office in 51 AD when he won election as consul. 2 consuls were elected annually, and during the Republic, they had wielded supreme power for their year in office. The consulship remained highly prized because former consuls typically received appointment as provincial governors afterward, positions that offered opportunities for personal enrichment through the extraction of reasonable tributes from subject populations. While some corruption was considered a normal prerequisite of office, governors who proved too avaricious faced potential prosecution upon returning to Rome. However, Vespasian did not immediately enjoy this traditional privilege following his consulship, having fallen from favor with Claudius, and particularly his wife Agrippina. Agrippina, who was also Claudius's niece, wielded increasing influence during the emperor's later years. When Claudius died in 54 AD, many suspected Agrippina had poisoned him, clearing the way for her son from a previous marriage, Nero, to become emperor. Vespasian had largely withdrawn from public life following his 51 AD consulship due to his deteriorating relationship with Claudius and Agrippina, remaining out of public view throughout the remainder of the 50s AD. However, in 59 AD, Nero, depicted by early imperial Roman historians as increasingly tyrannical and unstable, allegedly orchestrated his mother Agrippina's murder under the influence of his future wife Poppaea. Vespasian's political rehabilitation followed, and in 63 AD he finally received the governorship of the African province, encompassing modern-day Tunisia and portions of western Libya. His administration appears to have been unpopular, with provincial residents on one occasion pelting him with turnips. His biographer Suetonius suggests he failed to acquire expected riches during his African tenure, and consequently resorted to selling mules upon returning to Italy, earning him the nickname the muleteer, though this account seems somewhat embellished. These years also witnessed changes in Vespasian's personal circumstances. His first wife, Domitilla, died sometime in the second half of the 60s AD, after which his relationship with Antonia Canis became more sustained and prominent. Despite Suetonius's claims about mule trading, Vespasian retained sufficient status to receive an invitation in autumn 66 AD to accompany Emperor Nero on a planned tour of Greece, an honor that would not have been extended to someone who had truly fallen into disgrace. This proved a dubious distinction by 66 AD. If Roman historians' accounts are credible, Nero had become increasingly unbalanced, allegedly starting the Great Fire of Rome that destroyed much of the city in 64 AD to clear land for a vast new palace. He had also developed an obsession with Greek culture, games, and gladiatorial contests at the expense of effective governance. The imperial tour of Greece commenced in autumn 66 AD, with the court primarily residing in Corinth, the provincial capital. The tour's most notable event was Nero's participation in the Olympic Games, where he unsurprisingly won every competition. During the tour, Vespasian apparently offended the emperor by falling asleep during one of his musical performances, resulting in temporary banishment from Corinth as penance. Vespasian's rise to imperial power would never have occurred without events unfolding in the province of Roman Judea, just as Nero's Greek tour began in 66 AD. Judea, encompassing southern Israel and Palestine today, had experienced conquest by Babylonians, Persians, and Macedonians between the 6th and 4th centuries BC. However, in the 2nd century BC, a religious leader named Judas Maccabeus led Jewish resistance against the Seleucid Empire, one of Alexander the Great's successor states. Maccabeus successfully re-established an independent Jewish state in the Holy Land, ruled by his descendants for subsequent decades. This history forms the subject of Maccabees 1 and 2 in the Old Testament. However, Like all Eastern Mediterranean powers, this Jewish state eventually faced Roman expansion. By the mid-1st century, the Kingdom of Judea had become a Roman client kingdom, ruled by King Herod I as a Roman vassal. The Herodian dynasty maintained some autonomy under Herod himself, but following his death around 4 BC, Romans began consolidating control over the region. In 6 AD, the area became the new imperial province of Roman Judea, though Herod's descendants continued as puppet rulers. Roman rule in Judea proved consistently problematic. Jews practiced monotheism, worshipping what they believed to be the one true God, an unusual situation in the Roman world. Romans and most of their subjects, including Greeks, Egyptians, Celts, and Germanic tribes, were polytheists with pantheons of numerous deities that might bear different names in different regions, but remained broadly similar. For instance, the Greek king of gods, Zeus, had a directly comparable Roman counterpart in Jupiter. Judea's unique religious situation, combined with the activities of dozens of messianic preachers throughout the province during the 1st century AD, ensured that Roman rule remained tense by the 60s AD. The situation deteriorated further following Gessius Florus's appointment as Roman governor in 64 AD. Florus severely aggravated conditions in Judea by permitting sacrifices to Roman and Greek gods in Jerusalem's temple, the holiest site for Jews, as well as in synagogues throughout the province. He also increased taxation across the province and stripped massive amounts of gold and silver from temple authorities. When senior Jewish community members in Jerusalem protested to Florus, his response proved extremely heavy-handed, having some flogged and others crucified. These events precipitated the beginning of Jewish revolt in Caesarea in 66 AD, which quickly spread throughout the province and resulted in Jerusalem's swift capture after an insurrection there. Vespasian was not immediately involved in suppressing the Jewish revolt. Instead, Cestius Gallus, legate of Syria province north of Judea, was dispatched southward to suppress the uprising. However, his efforts failed completely. Nero, who was in Greece, recalled Vespasian from his exile outside Corinth for having offended the emperor's musical sensibilities, and appointed him to lead the revolt's suppression. He was duly dispatched to Roman Syria with 2 Roman legions, the Legio X Fretensis and the Legio V Macedonica. He landed with these forces at Ptolemais, the ancient name for Acre, in April 67 AD. There, he was joined by forces sent by King Herod Agrippa II, the Roman puppet king of Judea, who had fled the province when Jerusalem fell to rebels. Agrippa contributed several thousand loyalist Jewish troops to Vespasian's forces. Thus, with 2 Roman legions and thousands of auxiliary troops, Vespasian invaded Judea from the north in early summer 67 AD. Simultaneously, his son Titus, who had been preparing at Alexandria in Egypt for several months, marched into the province's southern region with the Legio XV Apollinaris. Between the 3 legions, auxiliaries, and native allies, Vespasian and Titus commanded over 50,000 troops. The campaign quickly achieved significant successes. Vespasian largely pacified northern Judea, known as Galilee, that summer following successful sieges of Jodfat and Tarichaea, while other major towns including Tiberias and Sepphoris surrendered without resistance faced with the advancing Roman army. Jodfat's fall proved particularly significant, as one of the Jewish force leaders there was Josephus, a member of one of Jerusalem's most prominent families. This highly learned Jewish rebel subsequently joined Vespasian's entourage and experienced a complete ideological transformation. From being a Jewish revolt leader in 66 and 67 AD, Josephus became an ardent supporter of Roman rule in Judea in subsequent years. He later became a free Roman citizen and even adopted the name Flavius Josephus in deference to his patron. He also began working as Titus's translator. However, he achieved greatest fame for his scholarly work after moving to Rome in 71 AD. Several years later, he completed The Jewish War, the most comprehensive account of the Jewish revolt written by a witness and one of the most detailed accounts of any ancient war ever recorded. His other works, Jewish Antiquities and Against Apion, offered accounts of Jewish history, culture, religion, law, and philosophy, ranking among the most important texts written during Roman times. Josephus would never have produced these works without the patronage provided by Vespasian and Titus, following his capture in 67 AD. Following Galilee's pacification in 67 AD, Vespasian began preparing during winter for a spring offensive further south toward Jerusalem, while also securing the Mediterranean coastline and linking up with Titus's forces from the south. This was a brutal suppression campaign, and even Josephus, writing about his own brethren, didn't hesitate to state that as many as 100,000 Jews were either killed or enslaved during Galilee's pacification and the coastal region's subjugation. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, various factions had begun fighting among themselves, leading some to leave the city and reinforce sites like Masada, an ancient hilltop fortification in southern Judea. Vespasian and Titus resumed campaigning in spring 68 AD, and over the following year captured numerous towns throughout the province in preparation for a major assault on Jerusalem. These included Jaffa, Hebron, and Ephraim. However, before Vespasian could begin besieging Jerusalem in 69 AD, events on the empire's opposite side led him to change course entirely. While Vespasian oversaw Galilee's pacification and prepared for his military drive toward Jerusalem in 67 and 68 AD, plans were developing to end Nero's reign back in Rome. The emperor remained in Greece until early winter 67 AD, not returning to Rome itself until the following January. Just weeks later, Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of northern Gaul, revolted against Nero's rule. Vindex was quickly defeated and subsequently took his own life, but his revolt triggered a chain reaction whereby other powerful parties indicated their unwillingness to continue serving Nero. Most significant was Servius Sulpicius Galba, a member of a powerful and wealthy senatorial family who was then governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, a province covering much of western Iberia. Galba commanded significant military forces, and his background ensured that many parties began supporting his cause once he rebelled. Nero's position became desperate when Gaius Nymphidius Sabinus, head of the Praetorian Guard, the elite troops stationed around Rome, also indicated support for Galba. The Senate subsequently proclaimed the Spanish governor as the new emperor, and realizing his grip on power had collapsed, Nero killed himself the following day. Had Galba managed to restore order and consolidate his rule following Nero's death, Vespasian would undoubtedly have remained in the eastern Mediterranean pacifying Judea. But events did not end in June 68 AD. Within days, many others were scheming to replace the new ruler. One such conspirator was Vitellius, a general whom Galba had just appointed to command the legions on the northern Germanic border. Vitellius repaid this promotion by taking these legions and marching on Rome. However, before he could arrive, a former ally and close friend of Nero's, Marcus Otho, ascended as emperor in Rome after the Praetorian Guards murdered Galba in January 69 AD. He adopted the title Nero at the people's urging, a development that questions the depiction of the original Nero as a maniacal tyrant. Why would Otho have attempted to cast himself as a new Nero if the emperor from 54 to 68 AD had been so unpopular? Otho then gathered an army and headed north to confront Vitellius and his Germanic legions. At the Battle of Bedriacum near Cremona, in northern Italy, on April 14, 69 AD, Vitellius won an overwhelming victory. Otho killed himself 2 days later, and Vitellius proceeded to Rome as the third emperor to have reigned already in 69 AD. But there would be one more in what became known as the Year of the Four Emperors. In the east, Vespasian and Titus were watching these distant Western events with great interest. They were currently suppressing the only major revolt underway against Roman rule at the time. Vespasian controlled the largest army anywhere in the empire under his command. Consequently, there was significant possibility that if he entered the civil war as a contender for emperor, he could emerge victorious. He made this momentous decision in early spring 69 AD, most likely once news of Galba's assassination reached Judea. Yet he did not move immediately. Instead, he began soliciting support from governors and generals of eastern provinces. Key to this effort was Gaius Licinius Mucianus, governor of Syria, the wealthiest and most powerful province in the region around Judea. With Mucianus's support assured, Vespasian was proclaimed emperor by the legions under his command in early July. Thereafter, governors of several Balkan and Egyptian provinces proclaimed their support for Vespasian. effectively making him ruler of the entire Eastern Empire and ensuring he had greater military forces and resources available than Vitellius possessed back in Rome. However, Vitellius still controlled the Eternal City. The civil war that followed between Vespasian and Vitellius proved shorter than many expected at the time. Vespasian's own actions certainly indicated he was preparing for a lengthy struggle. Instead of heading directly for Italy with his legions, many of which had already been sent westward under Mucianus, Vespasian headed for Egypt. His goal was ensuring maximum control of this province, upon which Rome and Italy depended for much of their food supply. Egypt served as the empire's breadbasket, from which huge grain supplies arrived annually in Rome. In the event of a lengthy conflict, Vespasian could cause enormous damage to Vitellius's cause by cutting off the food supply, but this would prove unnecessary. While Vespasian was consolidating his control over Egypt, Mucianus and another general supporting Vespasian, Marcus Antonius Primus, led his forces through the Balkans toward northern Italy. Ultimately, it was Antonius Primus who oversaw the campaign against Vitellius's forces in northern Italy, and after gaining several decisive victories, marched on Rome. Vitellius attempted to abdicate at this point in favor of Vespasian, but his supporters refused to accept this, and a bitter siege of Rome commenced. Eventually, Antonius Primus secured the city for Vespasian, but not before many great temples and other buildings on the Capitoline Hill in the city centre were destroyed. Vitellius was captured and executed on December 20th, 69 AD. Vespasian was now the undisputed emperor of Rome. Vespasian needed to move quickly to ensure that further unrest did not lead to new rivals for power emerging. He was aided by the fact that his younger son, Domitian, was in Rome and able to manage affairs there, while neither Antonius Primus nor Mucianus decided to use their forces or proximity to Rome to claim the imperial title themselves. When news reached Egypt of Vitellius's defeat, Vespasian quickly ordered the dispatch of huge grain cargoes to Italy to end the blockade of Rome he had imposed. Curiously, he remained in Egypt long enough to be formally hailed as emperor at a ceremony in Alexandria's Hippodrome, the empire's second largest city. Here, he was proclaimed as pharaoh, the ancient title granted to Egypt's rulers since the late 4th millennium BC. Once this was accomplished, he departed for Rome, arriving by early summer 70 AD. There, he consolidated his control over the empire by increasing taxation on Rome and the provinces, and using the extra finances to make payments to the legions, ensuring their loyalty and blocking another rival from emerging. The first few years of Vespasian's rule are somewhat peculiar, in that he effectively appears to have had a co-ruler during this time. Gaius Licinius Mucianus, governor of Syria, had been Vespasian's foremost supporter during the civil war with Vitellius, and without his aid, and most importantly, the troops he supplied, Vespasian might have been unable to defeat his western adversary and claim the emperor's position himself. Such was his role in Vespasian's ascent to power that he is believed to have stated sometime after the civil war's end that he had, quote, bestowed the sovereignty upon Vespasian, made him emperor. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we find that Mucianus held an extremely powerful position in the new reign's first years, leading some classical scholars to suggest he was effectively a co-ruler. For instance, while Vespasian was in Egypt after Vitellius's defeat, Mucianus was effectively governing the western provinces from Rome. Furthermore, he was appointed as consul, the most powerful political office in the empire, in 70 AD, and again in 72 AD. He largely disappears from the record thereafter, and it is likely that he died in the mid-70s AD, suggesting that until his illness and death, this powerful political figure may have been an unofficial co-ruler with Vespasian and a major power behind the throne. Of course, while Vespasian had been engaged in the civil war's latter stages, the Jewish revolt had still been smoldering in Judea. While the victories he and Titus achieved in Galilee and Samaria in 67 and 68 AD, as well as the infighting between various Jewish factions in Jerusalem, had ensured there was no momentum for revolt leaders to attempt retaking any towns or cities. In 69 AD, while Vespasian was occupied elsewhere, they still held Jerusalem, along with extensive parts of the east and southeast province. Until these were secured, the revolt was not over. For this reason, Vespasian had left Titus in command of a reduced military contingent in Judea when he himself departed for Egypt, and Mucianus proceeded northwest with the bulk of their legions. Titus subsequently continued regaining control of other provincial parts, and by late 69 AD, only Jerusalem and several other isolated strongholds like Masada remained in Jewish hands. Then, 3 days before Passover in 70 AD, his armies arrived at Jerusalem and laid siege to the city. This would continue for nearly 5 months, with the city crammed with people who had fled there in the wake of Roman advance. The siege became an enormously bloody affair, with many dying of starvation before the Roman capture of the city led to massive casualties. Josephus presented the wildly exaggerated claim that over 1 million people died in the siege, but while this can be safely discounted as the kind of embellishment typical of ancient historians, the death toll, nevertheless, must have numbered in the tens of thousands. Most strikingly, Jerusalem's Great Temple, the center of the Jewish religious and cultural world, was destroyed in the siege's final days, thus bringing the Second Temple period in Jewish history, which had commenced when the temple was rebuilt in the 6th century BC after the Babylonian captivity, to an end. Jerusalem's fall did not bring the Jewish revolt to a complete end. Some isolated pockets of resistance still required attention. These included the hilltop fortress of Masada, where the Sicarii, a Jewish sect, had moved and made their base of operations after a falling out with Jerusalem authorities in 68 AD, as well as Herodium in what is now the West Bank, and Machaerus. In modern-day Jordan, Titus, though, would not oversee the revolt's final stages. Instead, he left the Legio ex Fretensis in Judea to carry out these operations and departed the east, along with Josephus, to join his father in Rome. Because of the reduced forces left behind in Judea and some inertia on the part of Romans, who realized that isolated resistance pockets in eastern Judea posed no wider threat, it eventually took until 73 AD to complete the revolt's full suppression when Masada was captured after a long siege. In the closing stages, the Sicarii killed each other rather than face capture and enslavement by the Romans. A great proportion of their co-religionists were not as fortunate, and tens of thousands of Jews were enslaved following Jerusalem's fall and other engagements during the first Jewish revolt's suppression. Jerusalem's destruction represents the most controversial episode of Vespasian's reign, but equally significant were the punitive policies imposed on the Jewish people by Vespasian and his sons in subsequent years. First, Vespasian and Titus celebrated their victory, despite its bloodiness, holding a triumph in Rome to commemorate it. More damagingly, Jews were prohibited from rebuilding Jerusalem's temple, and the city was occupied by a Roman legion going forward, with army veterans also established in colonies there in a direct assault on Jewish heritage and religion. As a result, many Jews began leaving Judea for Egypt and other provinces in one of the first major early episodes in the long story of the Jewish diaspora. To compound matters, a punitive tax was imposed on all Jews, whether in Judea or other provinces, whereby they had to pay 2 drachmas annually simply for being Jewish. In all of these were sown the seeds of 2 further major Jewish revolts in the 2nd century AD, one between 115 and 117 AD, which engulfed much of the eastern Mediterranean, particularly Egypt, Cyrenaica, and Cyprus, where large Jewish communities existed, and another known as the Third Jewish Revolt, occurring between 135 and 137 AD. Scholars have suggested that the roots of modern anti-Semitism can be traced to the anti-Jewish views and legislation that first appeared during Vespasian's reign following the First Jewish Revolt. Judea was not the only imperial region in revolt when Vespasian became emperor. To the north, near the Rhine River's mouth in what is now the Netherlands, the Batavi, a Germanic tribe who dominated this area in pre-Roman times, had risen in revolt in summer 69 AD, taking advantage of both the civil war and the fact that Vitellius had pulled many Roman legions out of Rome's northern provinces, in Gaul and Germania, and brought them south to enforce his claim to become emperor. A local Batavian leader, Gaius Julius Civilis, whose name clearly indicates he had risen in Roman service and become Romanized, led this revolt, inspired by the actions of the German warlord Arminius, who in 9 AD had led a revolt in eastern Germany that destroyed 3 Roman legions and pushed Romans back west over the Rhine. But the Batavian revolt was nowhere near as successful, as the civil war ended before it could gather momentum and the Batavi failed to acquire allies among other tribes. Thus, while Civilis did manage to defeat and nearly destroy 2 Roman legions in battle in 69 AD, Vespasian quickly sent an army of 8 legions north under his son-in-law, Quintus Petilius Cerialis. With this massive force, which outnumbered the entire Batavian population, Civilis crushed the revolt, and a legion was stationed permanently at Noviomagus thereafter, the site of modern-day Nijmegen. Vespasian's reign evaluation presents multiple difficulties. Multiple detailed histories exist, written by Roman historians who lived during his reign. The primary ones are Tacitus's Histories, written by a Roman senator of the late 1st century AD, and Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars, authored by someone who grew up in the 70s AD and later became an imperial archivist and secretary in the early 2nd century AD. Tacitus's Histories covers the period from the 68-69 AD Civil War down to the Flavian Dynasty's end in 96 AD. Suetonius's Lives presents biographies of all Caesars from Julius Caesar and Octavian down to the Flavian Dynasty's conclusion as well. In both instances, they were eager to present Vespasian as a model emperor who restored order to the empire after civil war and years of alleged tyranny under Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero. Yet they were clearly biased. Tacitus belonged to an old Roman noble family that had fallen on hard times under the Julio-Claudian emperors, but was restored to prominence during Vespasian's reign. Moreover, his father-in-law had been appointed as governor of Britain by Vespasian, and he had clear reasons for presenting the first Flavian emperor in as positive a light as possible. Similarly, Suetonius's methodology was to present the Julio-Claudian emperors who followed Augustus as tyrants and to present the idea of a non-hereditary imperial office in the best light possible, given that his employers in the early 2nd century AD, emperors Trajan and Hadrian, had both been selected by their predecessors to succeed them based purely on their merit as individuals, not on family ties. These biases aside, Tacitus and Suetonius, along with Josephus, remain the most important sources we have for Vespasian's time as emperor. Suetonius proves particularly useful for his reflections on the emperor's personalities and characters whose lives he studied. Vespasian, as he depicts him, was a ruler who never forgot his humble roots, remaining amiable and down-to-earth throughout his reign and avoiding the excessive behavior that had apparently characterized the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero, each of whom had grown up as part of the imperial family. He was charitable, and this extended particularly to providing financial aid to old, impoverished Roman families from the patrician and equestrian classes. This latter trait may explain why he was so favorably depicted by Tacitus, Suetonius, and others who were members of or had connections to the senatorial and political classes in Rome. Moreover, unlike his predecessors, Vespasian is understood not to have developed the predilection for having people killed for upsetting him over rather trivial matters. One area where he was repressive, however, was in his intolerance toward philosophers, especially those who questioned the wisdom of imperial rule and society's hierarchical structure. In line with this, he revived certain laws that punished talk of restoring the republic. The overall impression is of a stable but conservative ruler, while many aspects of Vespasian's reign remain obscure or are quickly passed over by the main. Accounts of Tacitus, Suetonius, or the later Greco-Roman historian Cassius Dio, it is clear that he engaged in concerted efforts to promote his reign through various propaganda methods. Much of this focused on his building program, but other measures were also taken. For instance, Vespasian manipulated Roman coinage to present himself as the unchallenged new emperor. More coins, on average, for his reign's length were issued bearing Vespasian's profile than for emperors like Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero, while there was also a concerted effort to remove coins issued by Otho and Vitellius with their profiles from circulation. Given that for many Roman subjects in the empire's wayward provinces, coins were the most direct engagement they would ever have with a distant emperor, this was a significant move. This practice was followed by his sons in subsequent reigns. Vespasian also publicized certain divine omens presented as evidence of divine favor toward him becoming emperor. Romans took such divine omens very seriously, and the success of Vespasian's efforts to promote them is clear from the fact that details of them are related not just by contemporaries like Suetonius, but also by Cassius Dio, who was writing more than a century after Vespasian's reign. Vespasian was also a major patron of education and the arts. In contrast to his persecution of philosophers, he gave financial and other bequests to eminent poets and artists who lived in Rome and beyond, while set salaries were established for many teachers of Latin, Greek, and other subjects like rhetoric. His motives in doing so were most likely to foster the growth of a professional bureaucracy that would begin administering the Roman provinces and central government in Rome itself more efficiently, with tens of thousands of officials needed empire-wide to run provincial administrations, collect taxes, uphold Roman law, and manage the military from an administrative perspective. Several of the ancient world's most substantial scholars also worked during Vespasian's reign, and the emperor patronized them. Quintilian, a brilliant Spanish rhetorician whose abilities in ancient times were deemed second only to Cicero's, established a rhetoric school in Rome in the late 60s AD, which flourished during Vespasian's rule. The emperor was clearly a supporter of Quintilian, who was made consul in the 70s AD. Tacitus possibly spent time there, as well as Pliny the Elder, who in the 70s AD was compiling his famous Natural History, one of the foremost encyclopedias of knowledge compiled in Roman times. Pliny was also made a procurator by the emperor as early as 70 AD. A major aspect of Vespasian's reign was the manner in which he expanded Roman rule in Britain, where 30 years earlier he had been central to the first establishment of Roman rule in the south of the island. This had been expanded northward into the Midlands and southern Wales in the intervening period, but Vespasian desired to go further. In 77 AD, he appointed Gnaeus Julius Agricola as governor of Britain and charged him with expanding into northern Wales and even further northward in Britain itself. There is an unusually large amount of information on this campaign because Tacitus composed a historical biography of Agricola, who was his father-in-law. In 78 AD, the new governor initiated a new campaign against the Ordovices, the tribe that dominated the bulk of northern Wales and the island of Anglesey. The Ordovices had been campaigned against in previous years, but remained only partially subdued. By year's end, Agricola had largely completed Wales's conquest, bringing forces onto their island stronghold of Anglesey and forcing the tribe to accept peace terms. He subsequently headed northeast, campaigning with his legions into the Scottish lowlands. Hence, although he would not live to see it, Vespasian's directives to Agricola set in motion events that saw the Roman Empire extended into northern England and southern Scotland for the first time. Back in Rome, the emperor was becoming known for an altogether more peculiar policy. In ancient times, and indeed until as recently as the 16th and 17th centuries in some parts of Europe, urine was used for numerous industrial processes, including dyeing clothes, tanning, wool production, and as a detergent to wash clothes, as the ammonia in it removes stains. Consequently, as disgusting as it might seem to the modern mind, urine from public bathrooms across the city of Rome was collected and sold to various people involved in clothes washing and manufacturing. Nero appears to have been the first to introduce a tax on urine, which those who used it for these purposes had to pay, but according to both Suetonius and Cassius Dio, it was more systematically imposed by Vespasian. Alternatively, the urine tax might be misunderstood, and it may have been a simple tax on using the public bathrooms built across the city. In any event, Vespasian became so famous for introducing this urine tax that when municipal governments in cities like Paris and Rome first began introducing public bathrooms in their cities in the 19th century, they were called Vespasiennes and Vespasiano. Urine taxes aside, Vespasian's greatest contribution to Rome's civic life was the building program he oversaw. A vast proportion of the city had been destroyed during the Great Fire of 64 AD, and it still had not been redeveloped by the time Vespasian came to the throne, allegedly because Nero had planned on taking over a vast part of the city centre and building his new palace across it. His downfall and the civil war further stalled any plans to rebuild the city, so it fell to Vespasian to oversee this work in the 70s AD. Suetonius credits him with the city's restoration by allowing anyone who had been left homeless in 64 AD and who had subsequently left the city to return and build on any vacant lots, a move that seems utopian when contrasted with modern bureaucratic inertia when attempting to build anything. Vespasian also began redeveloping the Capitoline Hill, one of the 7 hills on which Rome was built. Here, he erected a Temple of Peace alongside the Forum. More significantly, he rebuilt the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, which had suffered damage in both the Great Fire and during the Civil War, and was reputedly the oldest major temple in the city, built hundreds of years earlier. This was where the triumphal parades of Roman generals and emperors ended, and was an iconic site in the city's history. Over on the Caelian Hill, he also erected a temple in honor of Claudius, during whose rule Vespasian's public profile had become significant enough to allow him to later claim the office of emperor. As significant as these other building projects were, Vespasian is primarily remembered today from an architectural standpoint for building the Flavian amphitheater, more commonly known today as the Colosseum. There had been gladiatorial games and other spectacles held in Rome for centuries by the time of Vespasian's rule, but these had no fixed home, with different amphitheaters, often built of wood, being used over the decades. Vespasian decided to rectify this and turned over land that Nero had earmarked for his vast palace for the purposes of building such a stadium. Building work on the amphitheater, which initially could hold an audience of over 50,000 people, commenced around 72 AD using money acquired by plundering Judea as the Jewish revolt was suppressed. Built with slave labor and out of travertine limestone, volcanic rock and Roman concrete, the resulting edifice was laid out in 3 tiers filled according to one's social class in Rome. While at nearly 50 meters high, it was probably the tallest building in the Roman world when finished. However, Vespasian would never live to see it completed. In the end, it was not until 80 AD, the year after his death, that the Flavian amphitheater was finished. It would subsequently be expanded to hold upwards of 80,000 people in future decades. The great amphitheater was nearing completion by the time Vespasian died. His reign, in the end, lasted nearly exactly 10 years from when he was first proclaimed by his legions in Egypt back in 69 AD. His demise came in the countryside northeast of Rome, near where he was born almost 70 years earlier. There is some dispute over whether this occurred on June 23rd or 24th, 79 AD. His death was described as follows by Suetonius, whose account is worth quoting at length. During his 9th consulship, he suffered a slight illness when in Campania, and, having at once returned to the city, he set off for Cutile and the countryside of Reate, where he used to spend every summer. There, despite the fact that his illness was exacerbated by an intestinal disorder caused by excessive use of cold baths, he continued to perform his usual imperial duties just as before, even hearing embassies as he lay in bed, suddenly stricken with an attack of diarrhea so severe that he almost fainted. He said that an emperor should die on his feet. As he was struggling to rise, he died in the arms of those helping him, on the 9th day before the Kalends of July, at the age of 69 years, 1 month, and 7 days. Vespasian was quickly deified, a Roman tradition whereby deceased emperors were deemed to have become gods in death. Following his death, Vespasian was succeeded by his eldest son Titus. Owing to his role in ending the Jewish revolt in Judea after his father had headed west to wage war on Vitellius, and the fact that he had held many prominent offices himself, in Rome during the 70s AD, Titus was well known to the Roman people when he ascended. He was apparently a popular ruler, benefiting in terms of public perception from presiding over the inaugural games held to commemorate the completion of the Flavian amphitheater shortly after he became emperor. Consequently, Suetonius and others presented positive assessments of his reign, but it was all too brief. He died of a fever in September 81st AD, when just 41 years of age. As he did not have any sons or a designated heir, he was succeeded by his brother, Domitian. This younger Flavian reigned for 15 years, and is generally understood today to have been an efficient but autocratic ruler who clashed with the Senate and Roman aristocracy. He was assassinated in 96 AD by a group of court officials, bringing the Flavian Dynasty, which Vespasian had founded, to an end. In his place, the Senate chose Nerva as the new emperor, an elderly and respected Roman magistrate and senator. Henceforth, for the next century, the empire was ruled by a succession of rulers known today as the Five Good Emperors, each of whom chose their successor based on their merits as a potential ruler, rather than familial or hereditary considerations. Vespasian's reign as emperor is in some ways difficult to assess. His rise was extremely fortuitous and came about only because he was in command of a large Roman army in the eastern Mediterranean in 68 AD, tasked with suppressing the Jewish revolt when civil war broke out back west. He was consequently able to use these military forces to wage war on Vitellius and become emperor himself. In the process, he brought stability to the empire and established a new dynasty that would rule it for nearly 3 decades. His accomplishments thereafter were substantial. He suppressed the Batavian revolt, expanded the Roman presence in Britain, and undertook a major building program, which included one of the most famed buildings in Roman history, the Colosseum. Yet, there are black marks against his name. The suppression of the Jewish revolt was brutal, although admittedly much of it was carried out by Titus, while the roots of anti-Semitism are in many ways traceable to policies he enacted against the Jewish people following the revolt. But beyond these issues, it is difficult to assess Vespasian. Overall, he seems to have provided a period of general peace and prosperity after the alleged tyranny of Nero's reign. But whether Vespasian's qualities as an emperor and the contrasting chaos of Nero's reign were inventions of Tacitus and Suetonius in their histories and biographies may never be fully known. Titus, later known as Titus Flavius Vespasianus, entered the world in the final days of December 39th AD within the bustling Campus Martius district of Rome. His father was Vespasian, who would become the 8th successor to Caesar Augustus as emperor of the Roman Empire and establish the Flavian Dynasty, one of Rome's more accomplished, yet relatively brief, ruling dynasties. Vespasian emerged from an unremarkable equestrian family, with equestrian referring to the social class ranking, below senatorial in Roman society's hierarchy. Born around 9 AD, Vespasian entered a Roman world that was relatively settled and stable, having weathered a century of bloody upheaval during the Republic's fall, culminating in the Principate's establishment under Caesar Augustus and Roman government's transformation from a republican city-state into an autocratic, administrative government responsible for governing a vast empire. Titus's mother was Domitilla the Elder, who came from relatively humble circumstances as the daughter of a quaestor's clerk from Ferentinum. She wed Titus's father Vespasian around 37 AD, though she would pass away before her husband's ascendancy to the imperial throne. The cause and exact date of her death remain unknown. The Republic's erosion arguably witnessed its first violent manifestation in the Gracchi brothers' deaths by their senatorial opponents in 133 and 121 BC. The elder brother Tiberius became tribune of the plebs, an office representing Rome's lower classes, and used his considerable constitutional powers, attempting to force through radical economic and land-owning reforms, despite fierce opposition from the patrician Senate. His apparent radicalism and power accumulation led to Tiberius and his followers' death at the hands of a violent mob organized by the Senate, and 12 years later, a similar fate would befall Tiberius's brother Gracchus when he attempted to rejuvenate his brother's ambitious and reforming legacy. These blatant displays of political violence and willingness to step beyond traditional political boundaries heralded a century of political chaos in Rome, with the incredible expansion of the city's empire and the riches, glory, and prestige this brought to individual commanders being a major factor in destabilizing a political system designed to organize a city-state's affairs, rather than an overseas empire of incredible scope and wealth. Victorious generals led armies, loyal to themselves rather than to the state, and thus statesmen like Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla started using violence and the riches they had accumulated on campaign to purge political enemies and violate hallowed customs. In the 80s BC, Sulla broke with centuries of tradition to march his army on Rome and declare himself dictator. Another issue the Republic faced was the lack of a major enemy power that could unite Romans in opposition. After Carthage's destruction in 146 BC and Mithridates of Pontus's defeat in the mid-1st century BC, Rome did not face an existential threat anything like that of Carthage in the Punic War. This lack of a powerful foe meant that Romans were increasingly turning on one another. This came to a head when a new generation of statesmen and warlords emerged, led by Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar. The wealth, popularity, and power concentrated on these men turned Rome into an effective oligarchy in the 50s BC, with the emergence of the first triumvirate, featuring Pompey and Caesar alongside Marcus Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. It was perhaps inevitable that such ambitious men would turn on one another, and that the Senate would fight to reassert its influence. The spark came with Caesar's campaign in Gaul, modern-day France, where his stunning and brutal successes garnered him unparalleled fame and admiration in Rome, and saw him possess an immensely powerful army deeply loyal to their leader. The Senate, now viewing Caesar as a mortal threat to the Republic, ordered him to relinquish control of his army. Caesar, knowing that such an action would almost certainly lead to his arrest, made the fateful decision to cross the Rubicon River in 49 BC with his army into Italy, thus beginning a great civil war with Pompey and the Senate. The decisive battle was fought a year and a half later at Pharsalus in Greece, where Caesar's legions won a decisive victory, forcing Pompey to flee to Egypt, where he was murdered. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar was the master of Rome and of much of the civilized world. However, this state of affairs was to prove short-lived. Though he was made dictator by the Senate after his victory over Pompey, his move to make himself dictator for life in 44 BC, coupled with his steady accumulation of power, was too much for many in the Senate who were accustomed to a political system in which power was competed for by Rome's patrician families, rather than held and bestowed by one man. These tensions came to a head on the Ides of March in 44 BC, when a conspiracy led by senators Brutus and Cassius, but involving dozens of senatorial co-conspirators, murdered Caesar at a meeting of the Senate, days before he was due to depart Rome to lead a campaign against the Parthian Empire. Rome was again plunged into civil conflict, which would last on and off for over a decade, until finally Caesar's adopted son and heir, Octavian, stood alone at the summit of the Roman world with total control over the army and state, and was given the name Augustus, meaning revered one by the Senate. During his 40-year overlordship, Rome would transform from a city-state republic to an imperial government, increasingly aware of and attentive to its provinces outside of Rome itself. Though the decades of Augustus's dominance over the Roman world solidified one-man rule at the political system's top, the Republic's demise opened up many opportunities for equestrian families like Vespasian's that were not available under the Republic's strict oligarchy, especially families from provincial Italy and the regions outside of Rome. Under the emperors, a vast bureaucracy for governing all the empire's provinces developed, and it became open to aspiring families from throughout the empire in a way that prominent political positions had not been open when a few patrician families dominated the Republic. Thus, although Vespasian's father was a humble moneylender and tax collector, his ambitious sons were determined to climb the cursus honorum, the Roman ladder of political hierarchy. Indeed, it was Vespasian's elder brother Sabinus who appeared destined for greatness from an early age, with Vespasian largely following in the latter's footsteps. Nevertheless, after military service in Thrace, Vespasian was made a quaestor in 35 AD, entering into Roman magisterial service. As he climbed the Roman political ladder, Vespasian was able to gain favor with the short-tempered, unpredictable Emperor Gaius, better known by his nickname Caligula, who held power between 37 and 41 AD. Exploiting the vanity of the young emperor, Vespasian used his public office to glorify the emperor's victories and harshly punish those who conspired against him. Substantial advancement for the Flavians came, however, under the rule of Caligula's successor Claudius. In the early 40s AD, Vespasian received command of Legio II Augusta, then based in the province of Germania. However, in 43 AD, this legion was ordered to become part of the invasion of the island of Britain. Roman influence had been strong over Britain ever since Caesar's first expedition there in the 50s BC. However, Claudius now aimed for complete conquest of the island, and its annexation into the empire. Under the overall command of Aulus Plautius, Vespasian led his force along the southern part of the island from east to west, ending in Exeter. Later, Flavian writers likely exaggerated Vespasian's exploits, claiming that he won 30 pitched battles. It is more likely that Vespasian enhanced his reputation through a good performance as a competent military commander, and he was rewarded by Emperor Claudius for his performance in the invasion. After this, both Vespasian and his brother became consul, the highest political office on the cursus honorum, Vespasian gaining the honor in 51 AD. As was traditional, Vespasian was able to administer a foreign province following his consulship, and in 63 AD he became proconsul of Africa, where he demonstrated his rigorous administrative and financial skills. At this time, Vespasian's eldest son Titus was around 24 years old. What little we know of Titus's early life is provided by the Roman historian Suetonius, who tells of Titus being raised at the imperial court and becoming very close with Claudius's son Britannicus. It was due to his father's outstanding performance in the invasion of Britain that Titus was able to be educated at the court of the emperor. Britannicus was later assassinated by the Emperor Nero, and it is said, albeit this is difficult to confirm, that a young Titus was sitting alongside his friend when he drank the poison that would kill him. Certainly, Britannicus's death would have a large impact on the young Titus, and he would later work to cultivate his memory. Suetonius states that in around 57 AD, Titus served as a military tribune in Germany and Britain. Military tribunes were officers in the Roman army who ranked below the legate and above the centurion, and was a traditional preparatory role for a career in the upper echelons of Roman senatorial politics. Following this stint in the army, where he gained praise and acclaim, Titus entered the legal profession and married his first wife in around 63 AD, Aracina Tertula, the daughter of a former prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the elite unit of the Roman army that served as personal bodyguards of the emperor. The couple had a daughter named Julia. However, in the very same year, around approximately 65 AD, Aracina died, and Titus then married again, this time to Marcia Fenilla. Fenilla was from a prestigious senatorial family, and she soon gave birth to another daughter. However, subsequent events would demonstrate the extent to which marriages in elite Roman society were dominated by political and social concerns. Fenilla's uncle, Marcius Sornaus, was a former consul who fell foul of the Emperor Nero in 66 AD due to accusations made against him for plotting against the emperor during his stint as proconsul in the province of Asia. His condemnation on false charges immediately blackened any association with his close relatives, and thus Titus divorced his wife that same year to retain his standing among Nero and his associates. Up until the year 66 AD, Titus followed a conventional trajectory into the upper echelons of Roman politics. At this time, he had gained a quaestorship and thus stood at the lower rungs of the senatorial class. However, things would soon change for Titus and his father, as they would embark upon one of the most infamous campaigns of the 1st century. In 66 AD, Vespasian was invited by the Emperor Nero to accompany him on his tour of Greece as an official travel companion. However, during this trip, Vespasian offended the emperor, leaving a theater or possibly falling asleep, whilst Nero was in the middle of one of his long solo singing performances. This led to Vespasian being banned from all companionship with the emperor. Later that year, however, Vespasian was appointed to the command that would dramatically alter the fortunes of the Flavians when he was sent to Judea in order to quell the Jewish revolt that had broken out there. It is not totally clear why he was appointed, but his relatively obscure background and the family name may have convinced the increasingly paranoid Nero that Vespasian did not pose a threat to his authority and would thus be suitable to command a large force. Nero's paranoia at this time derived from the uncovering in 65 AD of the Pisonian conspiracy, a plot to murder Nero and replace him with the aristocratic orator Calpurnius Piso. A great number of senators, equestrians, and military personnel were involved, and the emperor was in many ways lucky to survive. Nero's rule was dramatically altered following the conspiracy's uncovering, and Vespasian's appointment was thus likely made out of considerations for the emperor's own safety. with Nero assuming that Vespasian did not pose a threat to his power. By 66 AD, the situation in Judea was very serious for Rome. Judea had been a province of the Roman Empire since 6 AD, though there had been Roman dominance over the area since the 60s BC with the conquests of Pompey. Though the Jews were not persecuted for their faith as a recognized religious minority, they suffered under the heavy taxes imposed by the empire and by the appointment by the Romans of the Jewish high priest. This is because the high priest was chosen from the section of the Jewish population that collaborated with Rome and thus was alienated from the rest of the Jewish population. Tensions were inflamed by the influence of Hellenistic culture and the resulting emergence of a Romanized Hellenistic elite who dominated the affairs of Judea and promoted the cult of the emperor. Rebellious groups emerged among the Jewish population, known as zealots, who believed that any means were necessary to attain complete political and religious liberty and autonomy. Perhaps unsurprisingly, groups like this rose in popularity during the reign of Caligula, where the unstable emperor ordered his statue to be set up in every temple throughout the empire and threatened to destroy the Jewish temple when the Jews refused. Things came to a head under the procuratorship of Gessius Florus, as Florus had particular disdain for the Jews and lacked the political skill to quell the gathering tensions. In 66 AD, a revolt broke out in the town of Caesarea in Judea, as a gang of zealots attacked the Greeks living in the town after a Greek mob had profaned the local synagogue. Florus chose this moment to initiate a forceful gathering of taxation in Jerusalem, and as part of this, he plundered vast quantities of silver from the sacred Jewish temple. This infuriated the Jewish population. However, unrest was brutally quashed by Florus, who executed several city leaders. This only turned the unrest militant, and armed rebels destroyed the local Roman garrison and embarked on the destruction of Roman people and symbols throughout Judea. Rebel mobs also fought with Jews who were opposed to rebellion until the zealot factions won out and determined to cleanse Judea of Roman influence. Rome soon responded with the proconsul of Syria, Cestius Gallus, marching south with around 30,000 troops to put down the revolt. Gallus attempted to capture Jerusalem, but was repulsed after a siege and forced to retreat. His troops were then ambushed by Jewish rebels at Beth Horon and took heavy losses, including the humiliating loss of an eagle standard. Gallus died soon afterwards, possibly killing himself. This stunning victory galvanized the Jewish rebels and pushed aside moderates, hardening their desire for complete Judean independence from Rome. With Judea spiraling out of control and Romans determined to take vengeance for Gallus's defeat, Vespasian was appointed to put down the rebellion in late 66 or early 67 AD, and he set off immediately with Legio V and Legio X. Vespasian made Titus, now 27 years old, legate of his third legion, Legio XV, Apollinaris, then stationed in Egypt, whilst Vespasian made his way to Judea by land from Greece. Going through modern-day Turkey, Titus travelled across the Mediterranean and took command of his legion in Egypt before moving north. The Romans had around 60,000 soldiers in total, and Vespasian and Titus began the campaign in Galilee, in the north of Judea, and one of the most radicalized regions in the area. The campaign was brutal, with entire villages and towns being destroyed by the Romans. Titus himself was able to lead the final onslaught against numerous towns in the north. Although at Giscala, the last remaining rebellious town in Galilee, Titus fell for a ruse on the part of the rebel leader, which allowed a large group of the most dedicated rebels to escape to Jerusalem. Though unquestionably brave as a commander, Titus had not yet developed the careful and considered military approach that was definitive of his father. It is estimated that in 67 AD, as many as 100,000 were killed or enslaved in the pacification of Galilee. Meanwhile, Galilean refugees had fled to Jerusalem, and the Jewish resistance was now concentrated in this great city. As the Romans entered winter quarters, early 68 AD saw a Judean civil war erupt in Jerusalem between rival Jewish factions, with the radicals attacking moderate leaders and eventually solidifying their hold over Jerusalem. Vespasian and Titus were content to sit back and allow their enemies to destroy themselves. As the campaign season of 69 AD opened, Vespasian led his forces towards Jerusalem, capturing towns that anchored the city's supply route and tightening the noose around the city, destroying any rebellious towns as he went. Throughout 68 AD, Titus was in the province of Syria, seeking to sort issues of jurisdiction between Vespasian and the new governor of the Roman province, which lay to the north of Judea. Titus's deft political skills ensured that he won over the governor Licinius Mucianus, who would come to be an important ally to Vespasian in the important year that lay ahead. The importance of the coming year was soon evident as news reached Judea that Nero was dead, with Servius Sulpicius Galba declared as emperor by the Senate. Discontent with Nero had not dissipated following the Pisonian conspiracy. Indeed, it had only increased as the emperor became ever more tyrannical and cruel in the following years. Rebellions grew, especially in Gaul and in Hispania, under the governorship of Galba, and this increasing pressure led to the head of the Praetorian Guard abandoning Nero and declaring for Galba, and the rest of the emperor's guards then followed suit. Fleeing the city, Nero learned that he had been declared a public enemy by the Senate, and on the 9th of June, he either took his own life or ordered his personal assistant to kill him. Tacitus wrote that Nero's death was celebrated by the Roman upper classes, but was somewhat lamented by the lower classes, who had often gained from the emperor's excesses. Nero was the final member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had monopolized imperial power since the time of Augustus. His death was dangerous for the empire as the primacy of the Julio-Claudian bloodline had always limited the number of candidates who could claim the imperial purple. Now, however, that the dynasty had died with Nero, ultimate power could be competed for by a greater number of candidates, all of whom could command great armies. In Judea, Vespasian was unnerved by reports that Galba, who had been declared as emperor by the Senate, was executing opponents and Nero loyalists, and thus sent Titus east to pay formal respects to the new emperor and to win his favor. Titus had reached Corinth in Greece in January 69 AD, when he heard news of Galba's murder on the 15th of that month. Galba was a straight-laced disciplinarian, and his failure to sufficiently reward legions who had rebelled against Nero and the Praetorian Guard soon made him unpopular. Suffering from gout, the aging emperor was killed by the Praetorians. The Guard had been won over by Marcus Salvius Otho. Otho had joined the rebellion against Nero under Galba and had hoped to be named his successor. When Galba chose somebody else to adopt, Otho organized a conspiracy amongst the Praetorian Guard and rose to power. Thus, 69 AD was the so-called Year of the Four Emperors, and it would see the Flavian Dynasty establish itself as the successors to the Julio-Claudians as rulers of the Roman world, enabling Titus to rise from the upper echelons of Roman politics to master of the greatest empire of the age. Otho was the second emperor to take power in this year, and he was immediately challenged. Prior to Galba's death, the legions of Germany had rallied behind the provincial governor, Aulus Vitellius, as their candidate for emperor, and were marching on Italy, even as Otho established himself as emperor in Rome. Considering his and his father's situation in Greece, Titus feared becoming a hostage in the hands of one of the rival emperors, and so decided to turn back to the east. The Roman historian Tacitus presents Titus as contemplating at this point the potential for a Flavian attempt to take power, and it is possible that this played into Titus's decision not to pay homage to any of the rival emperors in the west, and instead help his father consolidate his power in the east. The difficulty of this decision is emphasized by the fact that he returned to Judea via Cyprus, where he consulted with the oracle of the Paphian Venus, who apparently favored Titus's decision, and he thus sped to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. Vespasian remained a novus homo, or new man, amongst the Roman political class, and was far from being one of the wealthiest or most prestigious men in Rome. Indeed, Vespasian himself was not a particularly ambitious man by Roman standards, and, as emperor, was well known for his indifference to the glory of the imperial office. Thus, his decision to make an attempt for the imperial purple was not an easy one to make. At first, Vespasian was happy to sit back as Vitellius and Otho fought one another in northern Italy. Gradually, however, Vespasian's supporters and advisors pushed him towards making the fateful decision to intervene, especially after the controversial Vitellius defeated Otho at the Battle of Bedriacum and was proclaimed emperor. Mucianus was particularly insistent, and as the momentum for a Flavian intervention grew amongst the Romans in the east, the legions in Alexandria proclaimed an oath of loyalty to Vespasian and declared him Caesar, followed by the legions in Judea, and then Mucianus's Syrian legions. Though the proclamation of the legions was made to seem spontaneous, in reality, the Flavian camp had planned their opening moves carefully and had decided to commit in the middle of June. Titus's role in his father's decision to march on Rome and his ultimate elevation to imperial power was extremely significant. Unlike his father, Titus had been brought up around the imperial court and possessed great ambition and the political skills and talents necessary to help make his ambition a reality. His winning of Mucianus as an ally of Vespasian in the previous year was pivotal, as the Syrian governor commanded as many legions as Vespasian, and their forces combined were considerable. Some historians consider Titus to have been the originator of the Flavian bid for the empire following the death of Galba. As the heir apparent to Vespasian, he had among the most to gain from his father's elevation. At a final organizational conference, it was decided that after ensuring the security of Judea and the eastern borders of the empire, Mucianus would lead a force west, whilst Vespasian would travel to Egypt to secure Rome's vital grain supply. Titus, meanwhile, was given supreme command over Judea and Syria and charged with completing the pacification of the region, which at this point in the campaign meant the capture of Jerusalem. Vespasian appointed his close ally, Tiberius Alexander, as Titus's chief of staff, perhaps a reflection of his son's lack of military experience in such an important role. Whilst Vespasian was in Egypt, the Flavian campaign met with unexpectedly rapid success. The eastern half of the Roman world had declared for Vespasian, and armies loyal to him rapidly entered the northeast of Italy and won a decisive victory over Vitellius's forces at Cremona. Vespasian's forces then entered Rome in heavy street fighting and dragged Vitellius through the streets before killing him in December of 69 AD. Having been declared emperor by the Senate whilst in Egypt, in 70 AD Vespasian departed for Rome to take up his new position as emperor. Titus had accompanied his father to Egypt, but in the spring of 70 AD, he departed to Judea in order to open the final campaign in the region. His army contained a corps of 4 Roman legions, Legio XV Apollinaris, Legio V Macedonica, Legio X Fretensis, and Legio XII Fulminata, and was supplemented by auxiliary and native forces. Titus's army likely totaled around 70,000 troops, a force even larger than that commanded by his father at the opening of the Judean campaign. Titus made straight for Jerusalem, ensuring the security of Roman supply lines as he went, and began siege preparations in April, around the time of Passover. The Jews in Jerusalem were by this time utterly determined to face down the Romans, and were composed of broadly 3 factions, one led by John of Gischala, a prominent zealot leader, and one of the Galilean rebels who had fled the town of Gischala to Jerusalem after deceiving Titus in 67 AD. Another important leader was Simon bar Giora, who had led the Jewish forces that ambushed Gallus's forces at Beth Horon at the beginning of the uprising in 66 AD, and Eleazar ben Simon led a third rebel force. The Jewish forces in Jerusalem could muster perhaps upwards of 20,000 troops, but more importantly, they were ensconced in a city with formidable defences. In the factional violence before the approach of the Romans, however, much of the city's food supply had been destroyed by fire, leaving the defenders vulnerable to starvation. The city was divided into 3 sections: the upper and lower cities in the south, the new city in the north, and the Temple Mount in the east. The city had 3 defensive walls and contained numerous fortresses at its corners. To add to the confusion within the city and to strain its food supplies, Titus allowed the passage of pilgrims into the holy city for Passover, yet did not allow them to exit. As Titus ordered his legions to surround the city and establish camps to the west of the city and on the Mount of Olives to the east, the Jewish forces sent out expeditions to harass the Roman forces, one of which almost captured Titus himself when he was carrying out personal reconnaissance. Titus ordered the construction of ramps and battering rams to breach the city walls. The construction of these was initially disrupted by Jewish sorties out from the city, However, the Romans began a concentration of artillery, including stone-throwing catapults, on the defenders, which pinned them to their defenses, using siege, towers, artillery, and bronze-head battering rams. Titus's forces were able to destroy the city's outer walls in only a few weeks. Concentrating on the north of the city, the Romans focused their forces on the first wall and the Antonia fortress. As his forces erected siege works and battered the inner walls of the city, Titus dispatched Josephus, a Romano-Jewish military leader and writer who had defected to the Romans 3 years earlier, and, now a Roman citizen, was a friend and advisor to Titus, to persuade the Jews to surrender. It is from an account written by Josephus that we have much of our information on the first Jewish revolt. Josephus, however, was derided by the defenders, and Titus's offer was rejected. After the destruction of the outer defenses, Roman forces were near to the heart of the city, besieging Temple Mount and the Antonia fortress. There was savage street fighting as legionaries were ambushed by rebel fighters. The Jews even managed to tunnel beneath the Roman position and undermine the ground beneath, collapsing and destroying many of the Romans' siege works. Amidst the costly fighting, Titus reconsidered his strategy and decided to intensify the blockade of the city by constructing a siege wall encircling the city to prevent anybody from escaping and any supplies from reaching Jerusalem's defenders. This wall was completed in only 3 days and was 4.5 miles long, testament to the remarkable engineering abilities of the Roman army, and it worsened the famine within the city considerably, leading to misery and atrocities amongst the inhabitants of the city. 3 weeks after completing the construction of the wall, Titus's men used ramps against the walls of the Antonia fortress and finally took the stronghold after fierce fighting, and they razed it to the ground. The fall of the Antonia left Temple Mount as the last remaining stronghold in the city, and Jewish forces had concentrated here in expectation of a final battle. Titus ordered a ramp to be constructed by the walls of the Temple Mount, and though the Romans initially suffered setbacks, when the rebels organized the collapse of a 50-feet-high colonnade into flames, killing many Roman troops in the process, Titus felt that the end was drawing near and pressed the attacks. The Jewish destruction of the western colonnade and the Roman destruction of the northern colonnade forced the rebels to fall back to within the walls of the temple complex itself. Eventually, amidst the fighting, the walls of the temple were set ablaze, though it was not clear exactly how this happened. Josephus, in his account of the siege, is keen to exonerate Titus for the destruction of the temple and the chaos that ensued. He claims that Titus would never have ordered the annihilation of a holy place. Rather, his goal had been to seize it. However, a much later Roman historian, possibly basing his account on a lost section of the mostly reliable histories of Tacitus, states that Titus wished for the temple to be destroyed in the siege so as to exterminate the Jewish and Christian religions. It is unclear which source to trust, as Josephus was keen to ingratiate himself with the Flavian Dynasty, and his patron was Titus himself. However, the latter source was written long after the event and likely altered the account of Tacitus. Either way, having finally broken the resistance of the defenders, the Roman army unleashed terror and chaos onto Jerusalem, slaughtering most of the able-bodied men and rounding up the inhabitants to be sent to Rome as slaves. The temple and the city were plundered of their wealth, including the sacred menorah, the 7-branched candle from the temple, whilst other sacred valuables from the temple were turned over to Titus by captured priests. To celebrate their victory, Titus ordered sacrifices to be made in the temple court to the Roman gods, even as the temple itself still burned. The Roman troops hailed their commander as imperator, a title usually reserved for the emperor, in gratitude for the hard-fought success. The destruction of the temple took place in August of 70 AD, although the siege did not come to a complete end for another month as defenders fled to the upper city. However, after besieging the walls of the upper city, the Romans met with little resistance from the starved and exhausted rebels, and that part of Jerusalem was overrun and met with the same destruction as had the rest of the city. After the rounding up and enslavement of the survivors on Titus's orders, the Flavian commander instructed the city and the temple to be completely razed, with the exception of a number of towers within the temple complex, to stand as a testament to the strength of Jerusalem's defenses. Josephus stated that over 1 million people died in the Jewish revolt, although historians do not view this figure as credible, as it was unlikely that 1 million people lived in the entire province of Judea at the time. Nevertheless, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, perished or were enslaved in the revolt and its suppression, and it must be said that Titus himself bears great responsibility for the brutality of the siege of Jerusalem. This is not to say that his actions were atypical of a Roman general subduing a revolt, and indeed, the Romans faced few revolts in the history of their empire that were as significant and tenacious as the Jewish revolt. But it nevertheless underlines the brutality of the age and the brutality of Roman rule that Jerusalem and Judea were decimated the way they were for their insubordination. In his command of the siege, Titus displayed the tenacity, the skill, and the brutality that was expected of Roman commanders and lauded by Romans of his day. And whilst the events of the siege are deeply unpleasant to modern audiences and have left a deep scar on the history of the Jewish people that has echoed through the ages and persists to this day, to most Roman citizens, Titus's reconquest of Jerusalem made him a hero and elevated him to almost godlike status in the eternal city. Before departing Jerusalem, Titus stationed the 10th Legion within the outskirts of the city. Vespasian wanted to make Judea an independent province and have legions stationed at its heart rather than in distant Syria, so as to ensure the events of 66-70 AD could never be repeated. Many sources depict Titus as growing arrogant and self-indulgent in the years following the fall of Jerusalem, making his father nervous as a result. However, many of the anecdotes that play to this narrative, such as his wearing of a diadem in Egypt, seem highly unlikely and were probably generated in order to emphasize his apparent transformation upon becoming emperor in 79 AD into a benevolent and loved ruler. That he would undergo such a dramatic change of personality upon rising to the imperial purple seems unlikely, though it is not impossible that his triumph at Jerusalem impacted his ego significantly. Titus held celebratory games in Syrian cities before meeting with envoys of the king of the Parthian Empire of Persia on a diplomatic mission. Roman military movements close to the Parthian border had generated suspicion, and thus the Flavian utilized his diplomatic talents to quell the nerves of the Parthians and was presented with a golden crown by the envoys in honor of his victory over the Jews. After his diplomatic business was complete, Titus returned to Rome by way of Alexandria in early 71 AD and was awarded a triumph by Emperor Vespasian. Since the days of the Republic, commanders who won great victories for Rome could be awarded a triumphal procession steeped in civic and religious significance, to parade the spoils of war and experience the acclaim of hundreds of thousands of Romans. This joint triumph was celebrated by Titus, his father, and his younger brother Domitian, and its description by Josephus provides our most detailed account of a Roman triumph. The rebel leaders Simon Bar Giora and John of Gischala were paraded along with hundreds of the most handsome prisoners, whilst the looted treasures were displayed for all to see, with items taken from the temple itself displayed most prominently, including the menorah, the golden showbread table, and a copy of the Torah. The procession, with Vespasian and his son at the center of attention as they rode in magnificent apparel, ended at the temple of Jupiter, where Simon Bar Giora was taken to be executed, and the triumphant general went to offer a sacrifice in thanks to the chief deity of the Romans for their victory. To the Romans, the events of 70 AD demonstrated the triumph of their pantheon of deities over the God of Israel. The procession has been immortalized on the Arch of Titus, which still stands in Rome to this day. It was constructed in 81 AD by the Emperor Domitian, Titus's brother and successor. The arch contains panels depicting the triumphal procession and the fall of Jerusalem, with the images closely paralleling the description of events given to us by Josephus. Particularly clear on the arch's engravings is the 7-branched menorah, which is depicted being looted from the temple and paraded on the streets of Rome. The arch has been important in art history and was the inspiration for the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Soon after the triumph, Titus's exalted political position was confirmed when he was formally granted tribunician power, which had since the years of Augustus's rule been the mark of an emperor or his heir designate. Titus, along with his brother, had already been given the title of Caesar by the Senate before his return to Rome. Though it may seem fairly obvious to modern eyes that Titus would be Vespasian's successor, in the empire at this time, primogeniture was far from the established custom. Indeed, Titus would be the first son to succeed his biological father, natural father rather than adopted, as emperor in the empire's history. Titus himself did not possess a male heir. Though he had been married twice, he did not show any enthusiasm for marrying again. Instead, he preferred the company of young men, with whom he was thought to have had romantic relations. This was very ordinary in ancient Rome, even if excessive indulgence in sexual relations with younger men was perceived to be a sign of moral decadence. In today's terminology, Titus would likely be best described as bisexual. However, there is no such term in classical Latin, and his romantic interests would not be seen as noteworthy or peculiar by the Romans of his day. Nor was there pressure on Titus to produce children, as his younger brother, Domitian, was being lined up as Titus's potential successor, ensuring that the Flavian Dynasty seemed secure. From 71 AD until the death of Vespasian, Titus was a close partner to his father and played a key role in the ruling of the empire, though he was never co-emperor. The hierarchy between Vespasian and those beneath him was always clear and adhered to. Vespasian held the titles of Augustus and Pontifex Maximus, head of the Roman state religion, and did not share them during his lifetime. Titus, however, held numerous important roles during the remainder of his father's reign, which underlined his position as the heir designate and ensured that challenges to power from outside the Flavian dynasty did not arise. Between 71 and 79 AD, he held the consulship 7 times alongside his father. This was by now a mostly ceremonial office, but it nevertheless is a testament to his influence at the highest levels of the Roman state. In addition, he was made protector of the imperial office and became praetorian prefect in 73 AD, holding command of the Praetorian Guard and thus responsible for the emperor's security and for security in Rome more generally. Titus also became Vespasian's chief administrative officer, in charge of penning edicts and dictating official letters, and he often represented his father to the Senate. Matters of strategic and civic importance remained the preserve of Vespasian, including masterminding the construction of the great Flavian amphitheater, known today as the Colosseum. Titus, however, seems to have been far from popular in Rome, as he often took his role as protector of the imperial office to brutal extremes. This, combined with a reputation for debauchery, led to him being seen as a second Nero. These tensions were fueled by his controversial relationship with Berenice, an Eastern client queen. Berenice was a member of the Herodian dynasty as the granddaughter of Herod the Great, and along with her brother King Herod Agrippa, she ruled a client kingdom of varying extent on the eastern border of the Roman Empire, where it is rumored the two engaged in an incestuous relationship. During the First Jewish Revolt, it was rumored that Titus and Berenice, who had supported Vespasian's bid for the imperial throne, engaged in a romantic affair. Indeed, Tacitus, writing around 40 years later, states that Titus abandoned his mission to Rome in 69 AD, not due to the civil war and the death of Galba, but because he was ablaze with passion for Queen Berenice. However, the exact nature of their relationship during this period is not truly known. In 75 AD, Berenice arrived in Rome, and it seems that her friendship with Titus was rekindled as she accompanied the imperial heir wherever he went and lived in his part of the imperial palace. Whatever the truth about the relationship between Titus and Berenice, the already unpopular Titus did not help his cause among the Roman people by being seen together with a controversial and influential Eastern queen. As the reputations of Cleopatra and later Zenobia of the 3rd century Palmyrene Empire would attest, powerful Eastern queens could become figures of hatred and resentment in Rome, especially when they were perceived as having a malign influence over Roman leaders. Indeed, rumors of Berenice's incest and Titus's overwhelming infatuation with her during the Jewish campaign may well have been slanderous gossip in the vein of that which swirled around Cleopatra in the 30s BC. This reached a head when prominent philosophers of the Cynic school openly denounced Titus and Berenice in the public theatre. though Titus responded to this denunciation brutally by executing one of the philosophers. He understood that his reputation was becoming tarnished in Rome, and sometime after 75 AD, he dismissed Berenice from his company. Nevertheless, by 79 AD, the year of Vespasian's death, Suetonius relates that the people of Rome feared the accession of Titus and of the reign of a second Nero, who would bring cruelty, tyranny, and excess back to Rome. His father was widely admired, having reigned with administrative prudence, competence, and being personally honest, moral, and decent. After the chaos of Nero and the year of the four emperors, Vespasian had restored order and prosperity to the empire, and through his calm and steady leadership, Romans were once more enjoying the peace and stability of the Pax Romana. The fear of what was to come after the death of Vespasian is evidenced by a plot uncovered in 79 AD, led by two of Vespasian's allies and supporters, Caecina Alienus and Eprius Marcellus. Though the details are very unclear, it seems the two men were plotting to overthrow the Flavian regime. Getting word of this, Titus acted quickly, and Caecina was murdered, with Eprius Marcellus put on trial and found guilty by the Senate before taking his own life. Though this threat was quickly dealt with, it illustrates the tension that surrounded Titus's accession and the fear that Rome's stability over the previous decade would not continue. Vespasian died in mid to late June of 79 AD, having ruled for a decade, and was immediately succeeded by Titus in one of the smoother instances of imperial succession in Roman history. Titus quickly set about proving to the people of Rome that they had nothing to fear regarding his accession. Soon after coming to power, Titus began to curtail the treason laws, or the lex majestatis, which were severe laws intended to root out any form of treason or plotting against the emperor. Having been greatly expanded in scope under Tiberius, these laws gave rise to frequent trials that prosecuted suspected enemies of the emperor. The punishment for treason was always death, as well as a professional class of informers known by the Latin delatores, who often fed emperors false information about powerful and wealthy Romans in an attempt to gain wealth and influence themselves. Titus despised these delatores, and his elimination of treason trials allowed Romans to speak more openly with less fear. Remarkably, not a single senator was executed during Titus's short reign. Similarly to Shakespeare's Henry V, Titus is portrayed in Roman sources as undergoing a momentous personal change upon his accession to the imperial throne. He is shown as suddenly grasping the gravity of his position and becoming a beloved character almost overnight. Whether Titus evolved more gradually, or whether his unpopularity as heir has been exaggerated, it is clear that in his short time as emperor, Titus made a deeply positive impression on the Roman people, becoming widely admired as his father had been, and being affectionately remembered in the sources both for his stewardship of the empire and his personal traits. Indeed, it is also possible that Titus made no such personal change, and that he was shrewd enough as a political operator to recognize his deep unpopularity in Rome upon his father's death, and thus the need for him to present himself as a transformed leader. Titus faced problems early on in his rule. However, just months after his father's death, Mount Vesuvius, just east of present-day Naples in southern central Italy, erupted in one of the most legendary and destructive natural disasters in human history. Pompeii and nearby Herculaneum were utterly annihilated by a wave of pyroclastic lava flow and buried beneath immense piles of ash. The disaster killed thousands and left behind a city frozen in time. Archaeological excavations in Pompeii have shed more light on daily life in the Roman Empire than anywhere else, as people and buildings were encased under layers of pyroclastic flow, and thus, when excavating, archaeologists have discovered the remains of the city and its people exactly as they were in 79 AD. Eyewitness accounts of the disaster survive, written by Pliny the Younger, a prominent writer and statesman. Some years after the event, Pliny wrote a letter to his friend Tacitus, himself a prominent historian, detailing the eruption of Vesuvius and also describing the death of his uncle Pliny the Elder, an author, naturalist, and statesman. The Elder. Pliny was then a commander in the Roman fleet stationed in the Gulf of Naples, and he attempted to organize a rescue mission to save his friend Rectina, though as he sailed towards Herculaneum, he died, possibly from the inhalation of fumes or from a heart attack. When he received news of the disaster, Titus appointed 2 ex-consuls to organize the relief effort, as well as donating substantial sums from the imperial treasury to aid the victims of the disaster. According to Cassius Dio, the emperor also visited Pompeii twice after the eruption, although no attempt was made to rebuild the city, presumably because the destruction was too complete, and building on the layers of debris and volcanic matter was too difficult a task. Titus's rule would see yet more disaster strike the heart of the empire when, in 80 AD, a great fire broke out in Rome, a conflagration on the level of the Great Fire of 64 AD under the Emperor Nero. Starting from the Capitoline Hill in the center of the city, it spread to the northwest and raged for 3 days and nights, destroying large numbers of buildings and homes. In the wake of the fire, likely caused by the unsanitary conditions in its aftermath, a great plague swept the city, heaping yet more suffering on the Roman people. As with the eruption of Vesuvius, Titus's response was widely admired. He offered consolation for the victims publicly through his edicts and sent practical help by donating great sums of his personal wealth to aid the victims and help with restoration. The sources say that he refused financial assistance from other individuals and foreign powers, instead taking the expense of the disasters onto himself. Much of the rebuilding work would take place under Domitian, though Titus personally oversaw the building of a new temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Rome's supreme deity. Titus won the hearts of the Roman people in other ways, however, and his reign was not one remembered simply for the natural disasters that befell the empire. In 80 AD, Titus took over the construction of the top level of the Flavian amphitheater, better known as the Colosseum. This iconic amphitheater, the largest in the Roman world, was begun under Vespasian and remains one of the great, perhaps the greatest, wonders of the Roman world that can still be seen to this day. It was located in a low valley in central Rome, surrounded by the Caelian, Esquiline, and Palatine hills. Titus officially opened the Colosseum in the spring of the year 80 AD and organized 100 days of games featuring spectacular gladiatorial shows in the new arena, which was, in the wake of the previous disasters, immensely popular with the Roman people. The shows put on during the 100 days of games included gladiatorial combats, chariot races around the vast arena, and a battle to the death between war elephants. At one point during the games, the stage level of the amphitheater was flooded, and a mock naval battle was staged between 2 groups of condemned criminals. These displays delighted the crowds, although the brutality of them would no doubt disturb modern audiences, as most of the criminals who took part in the naval battle, for instance, were killed. Another project completed by Titus that proved popular with the people of Rome was the new complex of public baths that were opened in 80 Titus AD. They were built on the southern slopes of the Oppio Hill, northeast of the Colosseum. Indeed, an access staircase was built that led from the Colosseum straight to the thermal rooms. The remains of these baths can still be seen today, though they were later dwarfed by the 3rd century baths of Caracalla and the early 4th century baths of Diocletian. Both the Colosseum and the baths of Titus represented an attempt by the Flavian Dynasty to augment a rupture with the perceived tyranny of Nero and usher in a new age of public beneficence on the part of the emperor. The land on which both of these projects were built was land that had been used by Nero to build his lavish Domus Aurea, or Golden House, a private palace of immense luxury that had been built in the aftermath of the Great Fire of 64 AD. With these projects, the Flavians were in effect returning land that had been used by the emperor to showcase his decadence and wealth to the Roman public to use for their own enjoyment. This was a symbolic